You're listening to Scaling Up Services, where we speak with entrepreneurs, authors, business experts, and thought leaders to give you the knowledge and insights you need to scale your service-based business faster and easier. And now, here is your host, business coach Bruce Eckfeldt.
Are you a CEO looking to scale your company faster and easier? Check out Thrive Roundtable. Thrive combines a moderated peer group mastermind, expert one-on-one coaching, access to proven growth tools, and a 24/7 support community. Created by Inc. award-winning CEO and certified scaling up business coach Bruce Eckfeldt, Thrive will help you grow your business more quickly and with less drama. For details on the program, visit eckfeldt.com/thrive. That's ECKFELDT.com/thrive.
Welcome, everyone. This is Scaling Up Services. I'm Bruce Eckfeldt. I'm your host. And our guest today is Stephanie Evergreen, and she's a recognized speaker, designer, and researcher. She's also a PhD, so she technically is Dr. Stephanie Evergreen. But we're going to talk a little bit about her background in that. She's also an author, so she's written 2 books, Effective Data Visualization and Presenting Data Effectively. And I'm excited for this because I think that so much of business in general, but certainly service-based businesses, when we're communicating with people, communicating with staff, with clients, with prospects, is about how do we visually represent the ideas and the data we're presenting. So I'm excited about this. I think we're going to learn a lot, and it's going to be a fun conversation, a topic that I love. So with that, Stephanie, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me here.
So why don't we talk a little bit about your background first, just kind of give everyone a sense of how you got into this space of data visualization, what was the professional background, and then we'll talk a little bit about the work you're doing.
Sure. So I started out at the university as a data nerd. I was doing research projects full time with people. We were running lots of surveys, just like being really good at collecting data, analyzing data. And then we would write really, really boring reports. I mean, like I was bored writing it, and I was the one with the most vested interest, exactly. Right? So I just knew this is gonna suck. So, so I started playing around. I started making my pie charts 3D, right? I'm gonna get this really jazzy and spice it up, and then I thought I was having more fun, but I was really only making things worse. Yeah. So. Anyway, it came time for me to have to do a dissertation, and I didn't know what I was going to study. So I went to a conference, and this is probably what a lot of people do when they're going to a conference. You look at the program ahead of time and you circle all these interesting sessions. I was like, oh, this is where I'm going to find my passion. And I would go to these sessions, and I was so incredibly bored. Yeah. I just couldn't even force myself, with toothpicks in my eyeballs.
3 cups of coffee.
Yes, right? And I realized it's because of the way people present this stuff.
Yeah.
It's all these bullet points, and no one can pay attention. Even when you want to, you can't pay attention to all these bullet points. So I decided that was going to be my dissertation topic, how we present this stuff. And that's when you get this opportunity to become the smartest person in the room on a topic. So anyway, I really fell in love with it then and started talking about those ideas, the stuff I was finding in the research, and everything took off from there.
Yeah. So you brought up, I think, the phrase that everyone loves to use, the bullet point, the infamous presentation bullet point. Yes. So I guess when we think about, let's kind of put a scope around this or figure out what we're talking about. Is this, I'm standing in front of a group with a projecting, big projection, and, this is what is on that screen? Or where do you what is the area that you focus on? Are you the area that you think that we really need to think about when we talk about visualization of data and visualization of these ideas?
It's all of the above. I think it matters when we're in big presentation rooms, when we're in small presentation rooms, just having a meeting with people. It's so funny to me that if we're having a meeting with 3 people, why we got to have slides? Why even bother? Just talk. Just talk to people.
Or draw it. I love it when people are good at, they can just take a blank whiteboard and they say, okay, here's what I'm talking about. And they can actually start drawing the things they're talking about. That's powerful for me.
Yeah, totally. And it matters. We see the same principles apply if it's a newspaper article or a long report or something you're reading on your phone. The same good best practices apply everywhere.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of the best practices, and then we can kind of talk about the different, when they manifest themselves in different contexts and, how they get adjusted and stuff. But what do you think are, or what do you see as being the important things we need to keep in mind when we're engaged, when we're trying to figure out how to represent these things or visualize these things?
Sure. It's interesting to me me because I got here because of my interest in the visual. But what I have found in all of my work is that everything hinges on our message. So it's really about the words that we use, and the visuals follow whatever the words are that we decide are important. And so I always make people start with your point. Like, what is your point?
What are you trying to say?
Yeah. And just say it. Just say your point, like in a way that your grandma would understand what you're talking about. Yeah. And I think that's ridiculously hard for people to do sometimes because the more you know about something, the harder it is to say it in a plain language kind of way. You know what I mean? So we wrap ourselves up in like all these internal jargon and acronyms and stuff like that. And we kind of bury the lead.
So is this, I mean, I guess is this sort of the fundamental problem at some level, is that we're often using visualization to try to avoid the fact that we haven't quite figured out what we're trying to say.
Yes, this happens a lot. And actually, that's the hard work, right? When I talk about this with people, they're like, oh, so we actually have to spend more time understanding our data. And I'm like, yeah, that's why you're employed, is to understand your data and tell other people the insights that you have discovered in it. So yeah, it is. It's hard work, but that's really why we have the job, is to do that hard work.
Yeah. Yeah. So kind of rule number one is really make sure you understand your data and figure out what is it you really want to say. What are your insights? I think it's another one too, is that I guess how much do you feel that people end up sort of presenting, just sort of representing raw data versus actually doing some kind of analysis and takeaway, saying, okay, well, so here's the trend and here are the 3 correlations, but okay, what does that all mean? Like, is that, I certainly see that. So I'm curious in your research, if you've seen that being a problem.
Definitely so, where we're just like going to show the data.
Yeah.
And I think that whole motivation to just show the data comes from a couple different things. First of all, that's how you're taught in academia. You're taught you need to just show the data, and that your audience is going to look at it and like analyze it in their heads and come up with their own insights. And that if you tell them the insights, you're somehow biasing them, you know? So, but it's ridiculous to think that in the real world, when you're talking to your CEO, she's going to want to study your spreadsheet that you pasted onto your slide and somehow like figure out the point. That's not happening.
Well, in fact, one of the reasons you have, sort of CEOs surround themselves with people who are incredibly smart in these different areas is to actually do the analysis. Like I could have looked at the data. Like I need your insight to actually come up with a conclusion on what does this mean.
Exactly. And I think the other piece of it too is a little tiny bit of imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
Like if we don't show people how smart we are, all the analysis that we ran and all the correlations and stuff, that they won't believe us.
Yeah.
And I think that we have to remind ourselves that that's why we got the job in the first place, is because they already believe that we're smart. Like we have passed that test. Now we can just stop trying to prove ourselves and just do our jobs well and tell people what we know.
Is there one? I'm just curious on that one, and this may be a little off topic for you, but I think you mentioned this kind of the imposter syndrome. I think the other one is, I certainly see a lot, is when presenting an idea or presenting a prediction or anything that's kind of future-based or risk-based, is there's often this feeling that I have to say, all right, well, it's 32, as opposed to saying, well, look, best case scenario or most likely scenario is 32, but, based on the uncertainty here, we could be anywhere from 28 to 36, and this is my kind of confidence interval. I do exercises with folks where we do this confidence interval. And I always say, look, any future or predictive piece of a statement or data needs to come with this second part of it, which is how confident am I of that? And I think a lot of times people get caught up in, well, we've got to show all the data because I don't want to have that sort of more complicated discussion of what are the ranges and what are the possibility. And we have uncertainty, but let's quantify the uncertainty so we can have a meaningful discussion of our planning around it. I think that's one that comes up a lot for me. I don't know if you see that in.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the more academic, the smarter the people are that I work with, the more they feel like they've got to have all these error bars and confidence intervals and stuff. But we have research that shows when we present that sort of data to the public who's not that data savvy, they just feel stupid because they don't know how to interpret it. And making your boss feel stupid is not going to get you a promotion, right? So exactly. I think I always say it's okay to talk about that stuff if you can say it in a plain language. If you can say something like, this is the future and we can't be precise, but we feel like we're going to be somewhere in this range, you're going to be fine. Yeah. As long as you can word it like that, I think it's going to be okay.
Interesting. So let's talk about the actual, what we put when we create visuals. What do we think about when we create visuals? What do we want to do? What do we not want to do? What have you seen that are good, sort of good best practices and strategies for that?
Yeah, so let me tell you the story. So I was in Orlando doing a workshop with the Fortune 500. They had gathered their like rising leadership, the management stars in
high potential
yes,
team. Yeah.
yes, they were gathered in this conference center for like a week-long training, and we were just like one day of it. So I go in to set up, and the COO is already there in the room. I thought I was in the wrong place because they had started like 7 a.m. with their workshopping, and the COO is there. So I got to witness this really incredible conversation where he was sort of like setting the stage for the day, for the workshop that we were about to do. And he said, "What I want to see from you in our decision-making meetings and our weekly operational review meetings, I want to see your slide that says your claim, like your insight, whatever, and then the visual evidence that supports that claim." And I was like, that's gold right there. That is what every boss wants to see every time we're presenting something. Even if it's just like a figure that's in a newspaper column that someone's reading on the Wall Street Journal, what they want to see is the insight and the visual evidence that supports that insight. Yeah. It's such a simple formula, but we feel like we've got to wrap it all up in a bunch of bullet points that are hard to read and all kinds of extra stuff that's unnecessary, when really the visual needs to stand on its own. So we need to have like a full sentence at the top there that frames the interpretation and then the evidence that supports it.
Yeah. And what's your thought in terms of, I mean, I certainly struggle with this, and I see a lot of folks struggle with this. Is this a tool that I'm using to present? Is this a tool I'm using to present, or is this a standalone piece that's going to get emailed around? And do we create two different versions? One where it's more just visual and I'm talking through the points, and another one where we put the points on the slide and somehow or in the notes or something. Should there be one thing that everyone's using? Do you split it if you're presenting it versus if it's standalone? What's your strategy?
Well, I think there are a couple of different solutions to this, but I see this happen so often where we're trying to get like a PowerPoint to do double duty. Yeah. It's supposed to be this read along that happens before or more likely after. And it's supposed to be the presentation that we show in the room on a slide or on a screen that's like 40 feet big, right? Yeah. And everybody loses when that's the case, because in the presentation room, they're reading. And when we write on slides, it's so weird. We collectively have adopted this very weird bullet point language where, like, when you're writing for a bullet point, it's never a full sentence. Yeah. It's not user friendly. You drop out
phrase, gerund phrase or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. And no one can make sense of that later. Right. So when they're reading it before or after, they can't make sense of it. Plus it's like in front of their face, font size like 20. It's ridiculously uncomfortable for reading later. And then when it's on the slide, it's too small. And it's like they're reading while you're presenting. So it's a lose-lose situation when we do that, right?
I call that the futon problem. It's a semi-comfortable bed and a semi-comfortable couch, but it really doesn't work very well for either. So
I love that. Good. I want to quote you on that later.
That's fine. Take
awesome. So I encourage people to let slides be slides. That's what they're built for. They're built to be our visual support. Yeah. And that what people really want later is a more helpful, condensed, concise handout.
And so how do you do the handout? What do you do? Is it the slide with copy? Do you create new slides? What do you suggest?
I make mine in PowerPoint, honestly, because it's just, I know how to use it really well, but I'll just put in my main points as full sentences. And it's just like, narrative on a one pager, like one page front and back at most. That's what is going to be helpful for people later. It's more readable. It's more friendly. Another strategy that I have used, sometimes people are just like, no, they're going to demand the slides. So I'll encourage people to use the notes, but it's not. But what you type down there can't be the notes for you as the presenter. It needs to be like the actual wording you want your audience to read. Yeah. And then we can go in and format the notes pages. Like all of that stuff can be laid out and designed beautifully so that it's engaging. And then it looks like a nice, sexy handout in addition to being awesome slides.
Yeah. The other one I do now, I started to do it more this last year, is I'll do a quick screen video of me giving the PowerPoint or me talking through the slides that I'll include as well. So
I like that.
Even if even if I have to kind of send it out, they also have me kind of walking through it. Now I don't have the interaction with them as much, but, and I can usually go through, I can, say an hour presentation that I'm going to do in person. I can walk through in a screen video in 10 minutes, more or less. It's sort of speeded up and I hit the main points, but at least they have something, some me talking over the slides rather than just them trying to just figure out, well, what would he be saying here at this point?
Yeah, I love that idea.
Yeah. So talk to me about the slides themselves. When we're thinking about kind of what we actually put on a slide and how, are there kind of do's and don'ts in terms of actually visualizing these things? And I know this is tough in an audio only podcast to talk about what do you see on the screen, but give us some rules or give us some ideas, things to think about as we're actually constructing some of these slides.
Yeah. So I think probably the first universal rule is no 3D. It's hard to have many universal rules because, you can always imagine a situation where something would be applicable, but I think no 3D is pretty much the one that will apply everywhere.
Yeah.
Because people have a hard time interpreting it in the first place. Like we have the research that shows people's brains just can't process volume very well. We can't compare volume. But in addition to that, like it distorts the data. If you make a 3D graph in let's say Microsoft Excel, it'll look like the data is a different quantity than it actually is. Like it almost is an unethical way of showing your data. So no 3D ever. Mm-hmm. Another good rule to keep in mind is 1 point per slide, 1 point at a time, because people get overloaded really quickly. Our brains really can't process a whole lot of working pieces at one time. So we got to break it down for people and like kind of spoon feed our information to them one bit at a time. And that freaks people out because they're like, well, then I'm going to have 100 slides. And I'm like, so what? No one's going to care if you have a lot of slides. The only time people care that you have a lot of slides is if they're all boring bullet points. Then they're like, then they look at the slide number at the bottom and they're like, oh my God, we're on 10 out of 100. This is going to be painful. But if they're gorgeous and they're engaging and you're walking people through everything, then they don't really care how many there are. Yeah. It's not extra time talking. It's just more clicking to flip your slide to the next one.
Yeah. Well, and give me, and we made this may be a little sort of digging into a little too much detail or sort of more detail, but give me a sense of like these build slides, animations, things like that. Like I see people struggle with this. Well, I both see people struggle and then I see people fail miserably with this where, things flying around the screen and, like 15 slides building up, like, in pieces, adding each step, what's your kind of rule of thumb or where do you guide people on the whole animation build, stuff like that?
Well, I do think that animation can help us achieve the 1 point at a time philosophy because it'll help us bring in one piece as we're ready to talk about it. And I like that strategy because it gives us some control over the conversation in the room. The worst thing to happen in a meeting is when like you're not ready to talk about that thing yet, but people are already jumping there and asking about it because they see it.
It's up on the screen.
Yeah. And you need to like get them there first, but they're not even hearing you and you lose control, right? So it's best if we can just not show them those things until we're ready and have some control. So using animation or builds can really be helpful that way. But I tell people the only animation you're allowed to use is the one called up here. Because it just shows
no swipe in and swipe
none of that
shade blinds reveal and stuff.
Let's not. Have you seen Prezi? Have you seen that software called Prezi?
I get motion sickness. I know that one. I'm just like, whoa, make it stop.
I know. And people loved it so much because it was like, wow, it was so cool. I remember being in a presentation for my neighborhood and the presenter was using Prezi and I could see the audience like, whoa, that's really cool. But no one was listening to anything that he said. No one remembers what that presentation was about. All they remember was that it was like zooming in and zooming out. And then worst case, like for you, it causes motion sickness. So we don't want anything that's going to distract from us being the center of in the spotlight, right? So no unnecessary distractions like that.
Yeah. So let's talk about the sort of some of these things that I think come up a lot in presentations in terms of like tables and charts and things like that. How much? I mean, I think I've seen it go either way. That there's so much sort of details and labels and fine information on the screen that I get lost in trying to read. Well, was this 6.83652 million, or was it there's the details versus sometimes it's like there's no labels and it's just an XY axis and a line going to the upper right, and they're kind of making a point. I'm like, okay, it would have been nice to get a little bit more context about what this is. Mm-hmm. Where do you see kind of the balance between these two issues?
That's such a good question because I do see people who get excited about minimalist slides, minimalist design, and they just go too far in one direction. And it's hard to have a clear answer, but I always say this is dependent on your audience and what your audience needs to see. Like how much precision does this group need to see in order to make the decisions that are on the table or to take the actions that I'm asking them to take? How many decimal places do they really need to see? How precise does this really need to get? I usually say one decimal point at most. 2 seems unnecessary, but if you have none, which I see that happens a lot when we're communicating to the public. We'll just round. People think it's not precise. People think you're rounding and it's not accurate. So 1 decimal point tends to communicate this is accurate. You don't really need to go further. But yeah, in terms of all the rest of the clutter that's on there, it's always about what does my audience need to see in order to do the thing I need them to do. And it's going to vary. You know, the public needs one thing, your CEO needs something different, your managers need something different.
Yeah. Well, and I think just got to go back to your earlier point as well. It depends on what you're trying to say. I mean, if the point of the slide for you is making a specific comparison between where we were in 2016 and where we are in 2018, and you're talking about a percentage or you're making some point about the data, having a little more accuracy around that so you can actually see it. It's not just 1 and 10, but it's 1.7 and 10.2. Like you begin to create some focus and some awareness of those numbers that I can actually start looking at it.
Let me tell you, I just saw an example like this where someone showed me this slide that they said they were having trouble getting communicated. The title of the slide was something super generic, like let's just say sales over time. So not insightful at all. And they had a bar graph that showed sales in each quarter or something. And each bar graph had a label on it. It was like 17, 18, 16.8, 16. And I was showing them ways to just generally clean it up. And then they told me that their point was sales had remained pretty flat. And I was like, dude, if that's your point, you need to stop putting the numbers on all these bars because people are going to
growing attention.
Right in. Yeah, people are focusing right in on how can we drop from 16.8 to 16 when really that's an insignificant difference. So I was like, don't put the labels on there because people are going to get distracted, right? So it really all comes back to what is your point?
Yeah. What about the sort of derivative calculations around some of this stuff? So if you have 16.8, 16, 15.2, like you have this data, but what you're really trying to show is the percent change between periods, moving to a percent change chart. I mean, how do you advise or where do you sort of see this kind of ability to kind of analyze the data, or ability to kind of come up with second order kind of results from the data and presenting that versus raw data? Like, where do you suggest people do that? Do you not? Is it situational?
Well, it can be situational for sure, but I think that you can show both. I think people do want to see both. What we find is that if you want people to see the change and you just show them the change, they're going to be like, yeah, but what were the raw numbers? And if you show them the raw numbers, they're going to be like, okay, but how much change actually happened there, right? So people need to probably see both. So I like to just tell it as a story, right? So slide 1, here are the actual numbers where we were before, where we are now. And then your title will end with an ellipses, like ... as if to say there is more to the story. And then the second slide that shows just the percent change starts with the ellipses, right? So that you're telling people these things hang together.
Yeah.
And they're two pieces of the same picture.
Yeah. I've seen some good ones too, where they either do a nice build, a nice layer, or, two parts of the chart where you kind of, the top part of the chart is, okay, let's get the raw data. You kind of present the raw data and then you say, okay, and if you do the percentage analysis, because then you can kind of line it up and you're kind of, you're creating some visual connection between things, but they're usually fairly well designed. Some thought has been put into it, but I think that connection, being able to almost visually show the analysis, saying, okay, here's the raw data, here's the first level, here's the second level, here are the areas that we really want to draw your attention to because we have some things to say about it. That kind of process can be powerful.
This is where the formatting, and it feels like it's tiny little stuff, but the formatting of our visuals matters so much because when you're going to put a lot of detail on a slide like that, little things like tick marks matter. Little things like the borders around your graph matter. We've got to be so careful to have visuals that are really clean, like going well toward that minimalist design philosophy so that people don't get distracted by all the unnecessary noise and they're just looking at the data. And then adding in little tricks like adding in stuff like an action color on the parts you want people to focus on. That way their brains are not getting overwhelmed by everything that's up there, but you can just hone people right in on the two things that you want them to pay attention to.
Well, so let's talk about color because you mentioned it. I've seen lots of these things that look like blinking Christmas trees. What's your kind of take, strategy, suggestion on when it comes to kind of colors and palettes and stuff? What are you a white on black, black on white? Are you grayscales with, pops of highlights? What's your strategy?
Well, I definitely think the research supports using gray plus some kind of action color. So gray should be there to de-emphasize some stuff because we tend to see that as anything in gray is sort of secondary,
background. Yeah.
And then an action color will pop out certain things, and our brain will go to those parts because we tune into color just naturally. Our brains just go to that. Yeah. So we use gray to kind of tamp down some of the noise. We use an action color to highlight parts that really matter. And then your action color is probably going to be your organizational branding color.
Yeah. Just stay on brand, or use the benefit of
stay on brand. Yeah. I mean, and most organizations will have a style guide that maybe gives you a palette, so you have choices of colors. And if that's the case, I like to play inside that somewhat because people have associations with colors.
Yeah.
And so we can use that to our advantage so that when we're trying to tell people everything's fine, we'll use like blues that say things like calm. And when we're trying to get people to pay attention, we can use things like reds or oranges to say this is an urgent issue, right? So the actual color we choose can be a part of the overall storytelling effect.
Yeah. Let's talk about some specific scenarios or cases that, a lot of business folks get into. So, I mean, the one that I'm always kind of curious about is the pitch. I'm raising money and things like that. And that's always a challenge because it's that I don't know how long I'm going to have. They might cut me off. Like I need to have some flexibility and then this kind of leave behind. So what strategies would you recommend? And the other thing about it is it's very future thinking. So I'm presenting lots of, in the next 5 years, we could, be at this level, things like that. Any thoughts or strategies for that situation where you've got a CEO or an executive pitching to investors and dealing with this kind of, what do I put on slides? How do I tell this story?
Sure. So 2 good tips come to mind. First of all, I didn't even invent this one. It came from Seth Godin, who does some venture capitalism. Yeah. He has this method of developing slides that he calls atomic development.
Ooh, okay.
And he means that you break your talk down into its most atomic particles and you present one at a time, which is what we were talking about earlier. One point per slide, right? So we already know that the whole idea of 1 point per slide is a well-received idea in the pitch venture capitalism community. Mm-hmm. But I think the other piece of it that would help a lot is telling people your bottom line right up front.
Oh, I like this. Yeah.
And I think what we tend to do is feel like we've got to tell a story. And in a story, the punchline doesn't come till the end. The moral of the story doesn't come till the end. And I don't know, I feel like that's kind of been a misnomer. It's led us astray because what people really want to know, especially in these high pressure venture capitalism meetings, is give me your bottom line. What's the point here? Yeah. What's the idea? Tell them right up front. And then, so you start with the big picture and kind of funnel down into those details. Yeah. And so, because hopefully they're still interested, your bottom line draws them in. They're like, cool, tell us more. And you'll finally get to that nitty gritty detail of here are how the numbers project. So that starts with their interest. And then if they're not interested, you save yourself so much time. And so they save themselves so much time if the bottom line doesn't even hook them. Yeah. Right. So I think it's about getting your bottom line clear, saying it right up front and making it really sexy.
Yeah. Other cases that you see a lot in business, situations that executives get in and how they can kind of strategies they can use to kind of deal with those situations?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the whole idea of telling people your bottom line right up front is pure gold because it works everywhere. I was at a big pharmaceutical company doing a day-long workshop with them. And on the lunch break, the 1 hour lunch, the senior vice president had to run to a meeting, right? They're doing their weekly ops review meeting. And he comes back from that 1 hour meeting and he was like, Stephanie, you are not even going to believe this. But we just spent half the meeting going, what are we even looking at on this slide? What is this even telling us? And if you think about it, that is such a waste of time and money and reason. He actually said that they had to delay the important business decisions that they were there to make. Because they couldn't even get the information sorted out to inform the decision. So that decision is going to be delayed by months. Because they missed the opportunity in that meeting, which means they don't take things to market as quickly as they need to, or they're continuing on developing things that they shouldn't. Yeah. Either way, it's such a disaster. Yeah. And it's all because we clutter up this slide with bullets that don't make sense, with insider jargon that don't tell a point, that don't show the evidence.
Well, and we haven't figured out what we're actually trying to say, or in this case, figured out what we need to be talking about, so then we can actually present, have a presentation that
Yes. And I feel like a lot of folks are in a tough situation because you probably have like really, really smart engineers doing the research and development on these projects. And they're probably reporting up to their boss who has to somehow translate that stuff to the CEO without using insider R&D language. And God help them, they're probably also using visuals that were just like produced from some engineering software that they're copy pasting onto the slide that are just like, Atari 1982 aesthetic, right? Who can even make sense of that? So exactly. I feel for them. It's tough.
Exactly. So tell me about the book. So effective data visualization and presenting data effectively. What can we learn in those?
Yeah, good. So effective data visualization is about choosing the right chart type. Okay. We have so many chart choices out there these days, and guiding people through how to make the right decision, how to pick the graph type that's going to tell your story, and then how to make it. And I'm talking about how to make that graph in Excel or PowerPoint, because Excel is just baked into PowerPoint, but how to just use the tools you've already got to do stuff that's stellar. And I love it because Excel is, I don't know if it's because Microsoft is so smart or it's because they haven't quite figured this out yet, but you can really hack it. You can make it do things it does not naturally do. And I love that flexibility. So, and it's really just a matter of showing people what the buttons are. It's such a small thing. Here, just push this button. But the outcome that you get is like, oh my God, people actually understand what I'm talking about here. So that book guides people through how to pick the right chart and how to make it.
Great.
The other book, Presenting Data Effectively, is more about big picture reporting, slides, dashboards, reports, how all of that stuff needs to come together to look well and to get your information across. And again, how to actually make it, how to push the buttons that do it. And both books are totally based in the research. This is what happens when you get a PhD, you're forever a data nerd. So I'm still reading research articles like for fun, you know? So I like to be able to share that stuff back out because when research is always developing. It's a field that's always going to be changing. But if you can at least say this is based in some science instead of just like my personal preference, I think we're all going to be better off.
Yeah, great. If people want to find out more about you and about the books, what's the best place to get that information?
My website's going to be the best place to get that information. It's stephanieevergreen.com. I've got information about both books on there. We have a cute little book trailer video so people can find out what's inside.
Awesome. I will make sure that the link to that is in the show notes. Stephanie, This has been a pleasure. Thank you so much for taking some time.
Likewise. Thanks for having me here.
You've been listening to Scaling Up Services with business coach Bruce Eckfeldt. To find a full list of podcast episodes, download the tools and worksheets, and access other great content, visit the website at scalingupservices.com. And don't forget to sign up for the free newsletter at scalingupservices.com/newsletter.